Next up, we have Steve Halsey. Steve? Steve is our Senior Vice President and Managing Director of Business Consulting for G&S Business Communications. He has counseled many Fortune 1000 companies on innovations within insights, digital analytics, as well as branding. And so, Steve, take it away.
Great. Well, we have some fun. I don't know, Mary, how we follow up on a panel that talks about getting their teeth knocked out, but we're going to talk about the C-suite today, and I would argue that many senior executives in companies today feel like that's just what they're facing on a daily basis. How do they stop from getting their teeth knocked out? So we have a couple of exciting things for you here today. We are unveiling our 3rd annual Global Street Fight Study that we're going to talk about as we go through today. But we've got a really great panel lined up here for our discussion. We have Ben Geier from Fortune magazine that I'd like to welcome to the stage. Ben is a very prolific writer. He does an awful lot on the online standpoint, and he has a very interesting writing style, very witty, really ties in cultural aspects. So I'm going to have a lot of fun with him today talking about things like senior executives at GM and what executive leaders can learn from Taylor Swift. Carol Gstalder of Nielsen has more than 2 decades experience counseling candidates. She's been in the trenches in some of the world's biggest crises that she probably can't tell us that much about, but she has experience being there in the trenches. She heads the reputation and public affairs practice at Nielsen, including responsibility for the very famous Harris poll, and we worked with her in terms of reputation today. So I told him I was going to have a little fun in today's panel of I'm going to put things up and have them react to it. So as we speak about getting teeth kicked in, or I think somebody talked about reputational resuscitation, I wanted to coin the new hashtag for today's discussion, reputational triage. Basically, there's so much going on right now where you have executives like the new CEO at McDonald's who's trying to figure out how do I breathe new life into this organization and really bring its reputation up. You have Mary Barra at GM who's really looking at how do I keep this thing from going into cardiac arrest and just going down. And then you've got CEOs like Shake Shack that just went public that they're really trying to put best reputational practices into play. So with all the crisis, with all the CEO change, with all the chaos and mayhem going on, Ben, has there ever been a better time to be a business reporter?
I certainly don't think so. You know, bad times always good for reporters. Good times also good for reporters because as long as something's happening that's not the norm, we have something to write about, which is good.
So as you're thinking about things like the issues that you've been working with, the article where you're talking about the changes at GM, from your perspective, what changes are you seeing? Because you cover such a diverse industry. You've got auto, you got Apple's My Pretty Pony. I mean, you're covering a pretty broad range of topics.
I do. I cover just about everything under the sun, which a lot of young reporters are doing these days. And I think that what's so important is that you can't underestimate the power of the fact that people can go onto Twitter or onto Facebook and say exactly what they think about your brand the minute they think it. You know, they don't have to write a letter to the CEO anymore. They don't have to, you know, go to the annual meeting if they're a stockholder. If they're angry, they just write a tweet about it. And if other people are angry, they'll do it too. And eventually it gets critical mass and it gets trending. And, you know, the rest is history.
Wow, Carol, did he set you up good here for this one? So my question for you is we've been tracking the last couple of years this group called Opinion Elites. I hope you can cover that. And in this year's study, basically they're not giving senior leaders that good of ranking, and they're breaking in a distinct direction. Can you shed some light on that?
Happy to do that. And what we're seeing is that these opinion elites are off the fence is what we're looking at. And when we talk about an opinion elite in the general population, these are folks that are more involved, more engaged, more knowledgeable. They're the one person out of 10 that tells the others who to vote for, what to buy, how to feel about certain issues. They're a critical stakeholder to all of you today in terms of helping clients manage their reputations and manage through times of crisis. And Steve, as you know, what we also found in our recent reputation quotient study is consumers are smarter and smarter. And Ben, you alluded to this, that we see that consumers are doing their homework. They're investigating companies before they make a decision to engage with the company, and that's impacting their behavior. Over half of the opinion elites and over a third of the public have decided not to do business with a particular company or not to purchase their products because of what they've learned about that company's behavior and conduct. So it's a high bar.
So Ben, you have these opinion elites that are out there putting pressure on senior leaders. You have activist investors. You have a kid with an iPhone camera. If you look at how accountable a CEO is today than ever before, my question is it fair?
Well, on some levels, I suppose it's not, right? Because a CEO is one person at a company. Obviously, they're a very powerful person at the company, but they don't control everything. And, you know, in the case of Mary Bear, for example, you can't blame her for everything that was happening in the engineering department there. But at the same time, when you become a CEO, you do accept the fact that you're becoming the public face of whatever corporation you're at. You're becoming the person who wears the flak jacket. You're becoming the person who takes on everything good and bad. And, you know, I don't see, CEOs pushing off credit when good things happen. So I think that in some ways it is fair. You know, a CEO is a stand-in for a company as a whole, and they're going to take the heat.
All right, let's go to our next speed topic here. Continuing the reputational triage thing, we've got our nice little EKG going here. And what we did was we asked the general population and the opinion elites to look at senior leadership and really talk about what are the traits that they wanted to see in a crisis. And so you see the traditional textbook PR things of let's be honest, let's be transparent. But the one, Carol, that surprised me most here was with all the chaos going on in the world, the second lowest score, less than 50% of the opinion elites thought knowing how to manage a crisis because you had previous experience was an important skill. That just seems counterintuitive. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, we took a look at that as well, Steve. And what we see is that each crisis is unique. And so how a senior leader or that senior leadership's cabinet and team deals with it has to be relevant to the specific crisis itself. And when you break it down, it really comes back to the important traits of being honest, being accountable, being able to deliver on the promises that you make are going to set you through a course where you are perceived as credible by your stakeholders when you're dealing with crisis. So these are high bars that both the public opinion elites as well as the general public as well are holding against leadership today.
So Ben, when we got this data, I was rather struck by it because it was neat for you to go in your time machine and validate our data back in December before we fielded the test. I thought that was pretty nice. But when you did your article talking about CEO in crisis, those were the exact things you were talking about: honesty, accountability, transparency. But what does it mean for you to be accountable? When you look at and you evaluate and you write stories on senior leadership, what for you qualifies as being accountable?
Well, I think some of it, you know, a lot of it comes down to how a person manages to make you feel. You know, when you look at Mary Barra speak after the GM, the ignition switch recall crisis, I felt like she wanted to change the company. You know, obviously she's a very great speaker. She's a fantastic communicator, and I think that's what it really comes down to, is communicating. It felt genuine. It felt like I could see results. And, in the article, I draw a comparison to the crisis at BP in the wake of the 2010 oil spill. And with that, you didn't feel that. You felt like they were only concerned with getting off the stage as quickly as possible. You felt like senior leadership there just wanted people to stop talking about it. They didn't want to make sort of the changes that were needed to prevent this from happening again. And I think that's why BP suffered so much more in public opinion than GM has, is because as consumers and as journalists and just as people watching the news, you feel like there's a real commitment when you look at the way GM's handled their crisis.
So Carol, when we think about the things we're talking about it, and we look at this odd mix now that CEOs being asked to do, okay? It's, I want you to be honest, I want you to be accountable. I'm not gonna give you credit if you have previous experience, but be genuine, be authentic, take all this stuff together, and oh, by the way, do it in a way, don't screw up, do it faster, I will skewer you on social media. Is that's really what's driving this wave of dark horse CEOs? We have a branding guy, not even from the US, is now leading the Golden Arches. We have an engineer who jumped protocol in a Japanese company, is now managing a major auto company. We have a financial guy who's now leading SeaWorld. I mean, what does this tell us about modern leaders?
Yeah, modern leaders, it's a balancing act, isn't it? One of the things that we see is that clearly, while leaders are going through crisis, they still have to keep the wheels on the bus. They still have to run the company. And I found this data to be particularly interesting there, to see it where you see innovation on this slide. It's lower in terms of overall priorities during a crisis. But in contrast, Steve, as we look at the characteristics of bold leadership, it's the second most important trait. So in your automotive example, Ben, at the same time that General Motors is dealing with a crisis, they're also focused very heavily on how do we continue to strive toward better, newer products for the marketplace. And as you look at this past year of dealing through crisis and what they were able to provide in terms of the recent North American Auto Show, again, another tremendous accomplishment.
Yeah, that's a great example, because if there's one thing that gets people to stop talking about GM's recall crisis, is the fact that, oh, you know, GM's putting out something to compete with Tesla. And all of a sudden we're talking about that instead of, you know, what happened a year or so ago.
All right, well, speaking about the ability to control modern media, I'm going to transition here in a bit to Taylor Swift. You didn't know I was going to tie that into a corporate discussion. But this was an interesting finding this year. Biggest mover in the survey over anything. The question asking those opinion elites, again, those most influential, what are the attributes of bold leaders? And we saw an almost 20% swing in a single year. From last year, 54% identified risk taker as a key attribute, 73% this year, which of course takes us, like everything, back to Taylor Swift, right? Go from country to pop, Nashville to New York. And you did an interesting article, and I've seen several articles about her savviness in terms of managing her reputation and brand, and I'll let you cover bikini-clad Taylor Swift in a minute. But she's also had some really prophetic advice for senior leaders, right? Haters gonna hate.
I think that's how it goes.
And shake it off. So what lessons can today's C-suite executive take from Taylor Swift in managing their reputation?
Well, I think that, you know, you referenced my article about, for those of you who don't know, Taylor Swift published a photo of herself on Instagram with some friends of hers in a bikini. And when asked why she did it, she said, well, there were paparazzi there. They were going to take our pictures anyway, and they were going to get paid, you know, $100 grand for it. So we thought instead we would take it. It'd be a better picture, and then they couldn't make as much money off of it. So I guess the lesson there is get out ahead of things, right? If you think that media or an activist investor or consumers are going to take issue with something that's happening at your company, rather than hope it doesn't happen or hope it doesn't end up becoming a big story, do something about it before anyone has a chance to criticize you about it, or before anyone has a chance to say you should be doing something differently. Realize that there's an appetite for something new and make that change ahead of time. And then, you know, you come out both as a risk taker, as an innovator, and hopefully you come out with something that will please your consumers and your investors.
So Carol, tossing it back over to you, I'll give you the choice. You can either talk about Taylor Swift or you can talk about why now. Why are the opinion elites breaking so hard at this point in time?
Yeah, and this one's particularly interesting to see such a dramatic change year over year. And again, as I said, the three most important traits in terms of bold leadership are strategic thinking, innovation, and taking risk. And what we see, it's those calculated risks. Where are we going to place our bets? in order to succeed. We also find that with the younger population, particularly those in the first 10 years of their career, this is even more important to them as they're evaluating leaders today. I was thinking through these traits as I was listening to Luke and Etienne on the first panel discussion today, because through those stories that he told about their evolution of the organization, all three came right up to the top in terms of that strategic thinking, that true bold leadership and innovation, and calculated risk. This isn't risk for risk's sake. This is very high-intense, focused risk.
So Ben, when we think about how we pull this all together, what does this mean for you in terms of the types of stories that you're looking for, how that you pull it together on senior executives? What makes a good, salacious, great story for you?
I'm always interested in people. You know, the last panel talked a lot about numbers, and I love numbers too. But at the end of the day, you know, statistics are about the actions of human beings. And so what I look for is what a person's doing, why they're doing it, and how it impacts the people around them. And so for me, a great story is going to be something where we can really look at what makes a senior leader decide that they're going to behave in a certain way. What's going into their calculus, and how do their experiences and their worldview affect the way they lead? Because everyone has different lives, different political points of view, different social points of view, come from different areas of the country, and not everyone will always understand why a person approaches a problem a certain way. So the stories I like to tell are ones that can really delve into what goes into these decisions that impact these huge, multinational Fortune 500 companies.
So Carol, you found yourself in the conference rooms with some of the senior-most leaders at companies, both in times of crisis and when they're trying to identify new opportunities. So building off Ben's point of view, how is a modern marketer or communicator supposed to counsel their CEO at a time when they're getting very conflicting messages from the CFO, from the chief legal counsel? How do we let them let their inner selves shine through? And how important is that? So what advice do you have for us?
Yeah, it's critically important. And what we heard in our recent roundtable with senior leaders is that they feel to some extent they're in a state of constant crisis. Perhaps it's not a recall, but it's a daily crisis that they're dealing with. And what's most important to them is really the ability for their counselors, their cabinet, their marketing communication folks, to help them understand through the lens of the stakeholders what's most important to their audiences. And then knowing that, they're able to really utilize their own authenticity to demonstrate and communicate messages and behave in ways that are going to resonate. You know, Ben, you talked about at the end of the day, these are people, and the extent to which they can understand what matters to their stakeholders and communicate in ways that are engaging and help the audience see their vision, the more successful they will be.
Great. And since it's a global street fight where we're talking getting teeth knocked out, dentists, and all that other good stuff, it's time for the panel up here to put up their dukes, and want to see what kind of questions you have on senior leaders today, storytelling. What questions do we have out there? Luke.
If you don't mind, I found the data in the study pretty fascinating. And I'm going to show my age a little bit, but so when I think about the classic crisis scenario, I'm sure even anybody that's been to school, you still think about J&J, right? And how it was handled. And transparency was the number one, and for many of us, it still is. I was just so intrigued to see accountability rise above that, and wondered if you could explain that. And it seems like, talk about the challenges the C-suite face. They owe us so much more today than they owed us, especially during a crisis. And is that fair, really?
Carol?
Yeah, let me comment first. The way we see that focus on accountability, it really gets down to ownership. I own the ability to identify the solution to this problem, whether it's a recall or any other situation, while the means to do that is being honest and making sure we're making the right decisions. But stakeholders want to see senior leaders own it and be truthful and accountable. And I think, Ben, you made mention of that in your article as well in terms of the GM situation, in terms of the ownership, that we're going to make it right. We may not know today how it happened, why it happened, but we're going to find out and we're going to make it right.
But isn't it true that and is it fair that they seem to be having to be accountable to every consumer today, whereas in the past that wasn't the case?
The bar is raised higher and higher.
I'm not sure it's fair, but it's just reality.
Yeah.
So Ben, when you think about that question in terms of accountability, and you talking about wanting personal stories and getting behind, what's more important, accountability of the individual or accountability of the organization, and can you distinguish between the two?
Yeah, I think that accountability to the organization is kind of paramount, because CEOs come and go, companies, in theory, last beyond them. But the accountability of the individual is important. No one likes someone who passes the buck. No one likes someone who constantly blames the people underneath them. And, again, to go back to Mary Barra, she didn't do that. She said, I may not have known, but I should have known. She said, my deputies may not have known, but they should have known. We fired the people that actually did the wrongdoing, but the fact is that as managers, we didn't probe enough, we didn't check enough, and we didn't respond to things as quickly as we needed to. So I think that's important, is, taking responsibility doesn't necessarily mean saying it's all my fault, but sometimes it's just saying I didn't react to a problem the way I should have. And I think that that's where the individual accountability comes in.
So when you think of that, I just want to probe a little bit more on that, and I want to move into a different space. I want to move into the food space here. So we have a new CEO for McDonald's who's came from the branding department. I would argue he's looking more at reputational issues first and looking how we can drive it through. Changing the menu, changing practices as they do in terms of poultry and those type of things. How do you balance that kind of accountability with the pressure he's going to get if all of a sudden they don't see sales increase?
That's a very difficult situation at a company that is in a very difficult spot, right? So McDonald's is under tremendous pressure because they're getting their business stolen in all directions. The rise of fast casual dining, chains like Shake Shack, like you mentioned, they have to adapt to a different world than the one where they dominated so much, in decades past. So it is going to be, a very tough balancing act for him, because on the one hand, he has to deliver numbers, he has to increase sales, and he has to increase revenues, but he's doing so during a way where he has to make a transition that may lead to some pain for gain in the end. So it is a tough balancing act of making sure you take the transition fast enough to appease people who know that you need to make the change, but slow enough to appease the people who don't want to go through too rough of a period while it's happening.
So Carol, how do you counsel a company through a radical transition like that, in a shift that's going to fundamentally impact the customer experience, the cultural experience, and the brand and its reputation itself? How do you do that?
Yeah, and your example of McDonald's is a good one, because that is an organization that we have seen decline significantly over the years in terms of their overall reputation. And at the same time, we've seen such an increase in societal demand for health and wellness as it relates to food, and especially in the fast food arena. So how do we support clients as they go through that? We work very closely with those senior leadership teams to understand who are the most important stakeholders, what matters most to them, and how they can prioritize their actions to begin to make improvements. If we look across literally the 16 years of data we have on studying reputations of the most visible organizations, it takes a long time to recover. So in terms of setting appropriate expectations for McDonald's or others who are going through crisis, we can show that it does take time. It's got to take consistency at that leadership level. And even in the case of BP, we've seen some significant positive progress there over the past year, but overall, they're still at a very poor range in terms of where their reputation should be. So counseling in terms of focus, patience, and setting realistic expectations is key.
But patience difficult if there's such a focus on short term and quarter to quarter, I
You
would
hit it.
argue.
Mm-hmm.
All right, what other questions? Here, our friends from IBM.
Hi, Kathleen Ryan, Content Strategy at IBM. Carol, I have a very basic question about the 2000 global elites. Without giving actual names, could you just talk about how you would define?
Who they are?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the study itself was conducted with over 2,000 individuals of the general population, and within that, we spoke to close to 300 opinion elites, and we defined them very specifically based on their behaviors. So it is not a demographic definition, but these are folks who are regularly watching, reading the news. They're following industries, and then we have a list of about 12 different behaviors to ensure that they are truly active in their communities. So whether it's being on a board, attending the PTA meeting, but they are very active, and so that's the key, is that it's behaviorally based, and they are also sharing their points of view with others.
So Ben, from your perspective, so we're talking from a research and a scientific perspective about these opinion elites. Who floods your inbox?
I mean, the people in this room mostly. You know, and floods is a good word. You know, it's I mean, frankly, and this is just an unfortunate truth, it's a lot of other journalists. I mean, you know, we're an industry that has a little bit of an echo chamber, and no one's going to deny that. So, you know, other journalists, entrepreneurs are big because a lot of them are younger, more active on things like social media. So, you know, a CEO at a company like Uber is going to be more likely to, we all know that he likes to give his opinion on things, and he's going to be more likely to be visible than a CEO at a company with a little bit more tradition. It's a little bit more buttoned up. And so younger, more entrepreneurial-based people are the types that really sort of manage to get noticed.
And so when you look at your reporting, like I said, you guys got to check out his writing style. It's just fascinating series of stories. So we talked about the Wall Street Journal on the panel earlier said that what they want is they want a story arc over time. So how can I take this story and milk it as long as I can go? I'm just joking on that one, but it's how do we see the broader trends in the long term? When you get a good story, do you try and follow it over time, or is it big impact, I'm covering it, and then, okay, I'm off to the next thing?
That's an excellent question, and it's one that every newsroom and every reporter struggles with, because we do live in a world where visits and clicks are paramount, because that's how we get paid. And so it is tough, because at a certain point, you know, I do maybe think I'd love to cover this forward, but I've got to spend some time writing more, you know, quick hit stuff. And especially as a younger reporter who sometimes has to fill in some stories that maybe older reporters don't have time for, or just can't get around to, or you know, feel like maybe someone else should cover. You know, I do have to sort of plug in on some things that I maybe am not as familiar with, that maybe don't have a lot of legs. And in some ways, that's great, because you know, my very first journalism professor I ever had told me that the best part about our job is that we get paid to be curious. And so I like to sort of embrace that when maybe I get a story like the unicorn toys that you talked about. I don't own any unicorn toys personally, and don't know too much about them. So it was nice to, you know, I got to think, hey, this is kind of weird, but let me look into it. And so it was nice to sort of get into something that normally I would never learn about. And so to get back to your question, I do try to follow stories over time, especially big ones, like the GM crisis. Every time something happened, I tried to follow up on that. I tried to look for points of view that maybe hadn't been covered on it. And, a lot of times it's a battle of fitting in. For journalists, it's a battle of, using your time and finding a good balance between getting out those quick hits that might drive, website traffic and really taking time to think more critically.
Great. I think we had a question over here.
Yeah. It seems to me that the top three indicators up there, for me, I sum those up in the word of trust. Being accountable, honest, and delivering. It seems like people want, what that's telling me is people want trust. They want to be able to trust CEOs and just organizations. So I think there's I guess there's just a great need for that, because we hear time and time again how people don't trust Congress, they don't trust CEOs, they don't trust lawyers, they don't trust media. I mean, there's just this dearth sort of a trust, I think. So people are just hungry to be able to trust. And so I'm wondering, in your opinion, do you think that is that what's happening? And then the other word that comes to mind is empathy, that they want empathy too, because, you could argue that the BP, the CEO for BP, at least who initially took care of the situation in the U.S., he was honest, and he said, I don't like this affecting my personal life. I can't get on my boat and things like that. And everybody was like horrified that he said that. So he was being honest, but he certainly didn't have empathy for those who were being affected. So I think you got to have honesty with empathy. You got to be thinking about the audience, not yourself, right? And you got to be able to project that. So those are my observations. I mean, what do you think of those? Would you agree, or
I would wholeheartedly agree. And in fact, all the not to get too much in the data, but all of the analysis that we do, and we're trying to look at what are those drivers of reputation, that emotional connection and trust is absolutely the strongest driver, particularly in times of crisis.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I just think generally, if you're gonna talk and you're gonna complain about how tough rich people have it, don't. Even if you're right, it doesn't play well. I think that's kind of a good general rule.
All right, anybody else while we have the panel here? Well, while you guys are thinking of your question, I'm going to get your guys' reaction to one more slide here. I'm going to take us back to the automotive industry, and Carol, maybe you can give us a little bit more color on this, but the Harris poll does over time the RQ study that looks at the reputations of the top studies. And I found this fascinating because we talk about a world of new CEOs. Let's look at the auto industry. And it's interesting when I look at the peaks and valleys and things like here, and we're going to come back to your story again here, Ben, is that, as I look at this, I'll start with GM, right? You look at their reputation is going up, going up. They have the recalls. They bring in a new CEO who's very transparent, who's very honest, who's fundamentally changing the culture, and their reputation starts going down. Why?
Well, I think it takes time, right? Even if people like Mary Barra, and I think that generally people do, they still have some negative feelings. Now, I think that at the end of this year, it'll be interesting to look at where it is, because we're going to see how much money gets given out in the compensation program. We're going to see, how many recalls they have this year. Hopefully, we're going to see some cool new cars from them. So I think that, all of those things combined, you can't expect to completely, no matter how well you handle a crisis, if it's something that affects consumers, you can't expect it to have no impact. So I think that, if you look at this chart, it looks like they had a way bigger drop because of the financial issues they had than anything having to do with safety. Because I think that people, in some ways, have realized that this was a mistake, one that happened that was tragic and resulted in a lot of people, unfortunately, being injured or killed, but it's one that they addressed and fixed when they finally when they were able to, when Mary Barra came in and when it became apparent that something very bad had happened, whereas financial problems are seen more as an incompetence. And so I think that it's remarkable that the change is, even though it is a dip, it's relatively small, and I think that it's definitely recoverable.
Yeah, and that's right on, because as we look at it, and all this data is in the public domain, and we've tracked it for 16 years now, those lows for GM absolutely were at that time of bankruptcy. And we were pleasantly surprised to see that it did not drop terribly much. And in fact, if you look at the arc on Honda actually dropped more. And one other area that we see here is that it's a halo on the industry. So while the recalls are very heavy in terms of GM, it's touched almost every manufacturer at this point. So we definitely see a drop in overall perceptions of the automotive industry. That being said, there's been a stalwart in terms of Ford's very consistent reputation through the years, very proactive in terms of overall reputation management that we see. And I'll just, one color behind the data here, we look at a variety of dimensions of reputation when we do this work. What was intriguing to me in the GM data this year is the dimension on vision and leadership was one of the highest rated, even though still in a very challenging range with their overall score. I think the public is seeing and the opinion leads are seeing or expressing confidence in vision and leadership today.
And I think what you said about the halo on the whole industry is dead on too, because I spoke to some people about, GM's getting all this terrible press. They're, Mary Barra speaking in front of Congress. She's having global seminars where she's basically saying, we're sorry. Why aren't their sales being impacted?
Right.
And he said, well, everyone's having recalls. So, whether you buy a Toyota or a Honda, a Ford or a GM car, your chances of getting a recall are about the same. Mm-hmm. So people are making decisions not based on that. So I think that's a really great point, that the whole auto industry oftentimes goes through these trends at the same time.
Right.
So when you look at a chart like this, okay, I want to take us out of the auto industry, but so say you're counseling the senior executives at the company that's got a green bar. You're fairly stable. Your competitors are going through crisis. How do you convince them not to get complacent?
Thankfully, most leaders today know that reputation is a vital asset that has to be managed the same way that every other business area is to be managed. So I think there's an acceptance among senior leaders today that proactive reputation management is just like having a bank account and building that equity over time, so that when it's your turn to have the crisis, you can draw on that equity and have the benefit of doubt of those stakeholders that you've very much built proactively through the years.
Any other questions? We have time for another question.
Looking at that 20% jump in risk-taking as a characteristic, what role does the economy play in that? And does that afford leaders the opportunity to take risks? And if we look back at, let's say, the last recession, what would you expect that number to be, and what characteristic would replace risk?
Yeah. We definitely see that as we look at the trends across just the broader economic polling that we do at the Harris poll, and then specifically on reputation management. A sense of confidence and stability that leads one to have the ability to take those calculated risks. Much more difficult to do in trying times.
So as we come back then to this notion of the reputational triage, and how do we breathe new life in the company? How do we resuscitate it? How do we promote better health? Who's your favorite corporate story right now?
I mean, I think that if you look at one that's my favorite to look at is two companies in congruence, and I like looking at McDonald's and Chipotle, because they're so interesting, because Chipotle used to be a McDonald's company. And, I don't cover food that much myself, but I have friends who do, and we talk about it. And, every quarter you look at the difference between McDonald's earnings and Chipotle's earnings, and just how, Chipotle's are these sunny, great story, and McDonald's every month it's like, well, what happened now? And so I think that following that now and for the years to come is going to be fascinating to see both how McDonald's learns from Chipotle and what a company like Chipotle does to avoid some of the pitfalls that maybe have fallen McDonald's in recent years.
So Carol, from your standpoint, I know you guys released your RQ study findings here not too long ago. What's your favorite story in the RQ findings?
My favorite story, and I would say that not necessarily a positive story, but I found it fascinating how how long it's taking for the financial services industry to recover. And so if you look into the data of the story, there's a lot of wonderful headlines on who's doing well in terms of reputation management. But it's far more interesting for me to look at, gosh, what are the challenges that companies are facing today, and is there a particular influence of the industry? And we see still a very troubled state for financial services companies. And while some have been able to identify ways to differentiate and begin to make a move toward a more positive stance, I think it's going to be several years yet before we see the industry really rise again.
But we look at, you know, the indicators, the stock market's doing better, the economy's doing better. We all need money. We all need access to money. So why has the finance industry not been able to break through?
I mean, I think it's a couple of things. I think one thing it's that, you know, trust, as we discussed earlier, is the number one thing. And if you recall, some things happened a few years ago that made it difficult for people to trust the financial services industry. And that is very difficult to overcome. I mean, and I think there's also the fact that even before that, I mean, it's hard to really love a bank, you know? You can love a company that makes something you like. You can love a company that you like, that has a restaurant you like to eat at. Very few people think, man, I love my bank. And so I think that that is just sort of a natural thing that you know, consumers are going to have trouble, that financial services companies are going to have trouble getting across to consumers. And, you know, from a media point of view, you know, it's not, you know, sorry, but it's not that interesting when banks are sort of steady. It's interesting when something interesting's happening, when something different's happening, and oftentimes that's something less than flattering to banks. And I think that's just a natural indication of what, you know, news consumers and just the general population finds interesting about the financial services industry.
Yeah.
So, Carol, is there a secret sauce? We've got a lot of people from the financial services industry. Is there a secret sauce that they can do to bump up their reputation, or is it just sweat equity over time?
I think each organization has a keen eye to what that secret sauce is for them. One of the themes that we did see come throughout the entire study is a sense of local touch points. So from a bank perspective, we certainly see stronger reputation among credit unions. So again, it gets back to that experience. So are you at every touch point with your customer or stakeholder delivering an exceptional experience?
All right. That's good. This has been a very fun panel. We've covered how today's CEOs can learn from Taylor Swift. We've talked about foods. We've talked about cars. I think we even worked bikinis into the conversation. So I want to thank my panel. This has been an absolute joy to cover. And Luke, I'm not sure, did you want to give a few words to close us down?
Also wanted to thank Steve, Carol, and Ben. That was fascinating, some great data. Thank you all for coming. That's it for the program. And again, encourage you to stick around. Looks like there's a few snacks still left. Network, talk about the program, talk to your peers, and maybe catch a couple of our speakers that are still here. So thanks very much. Really appreciate it. Carol, that was great. You guys had a little bit of everything. Thank you so much.